I stood at the edge of my bed, my heart racing, eyes swollen from the tears that wouldn't stop flowing. "How did we get here, Philip?" I whispered to myself. The man I loved, the one who promised to be my rock, was now the source of my deepest frustrations. Philip had always been gentle, soft-spoken, and kind, but somewhere along the line something shifted. The weight of his shortcomings started to crush me. His inability to lead, his indecisiveness, and lack of sensitivity to my emotions left me feeling abandoned, emotionally drained. I loved him dearly, but the list of things that drove me crazy about him grew every day. I wanted him to be strong, to make decisions without me having to push him. A man who could stand tall and take charge when life threw us challenges. But instead, Philip hesitated at every turn. He would dress as though he didn't care about his appearance, and his lack of attention to the kids and me made me feel like we were invisible. It was as if he had completely stopped seeing us. There were nights I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was all there was. The constant quarrels, the endless complaints. I found myself comparing him to other men, men who cared for their families, who took control, who were not drowning in debt, and who knew how to love their wives without requiring something in return every time. But here was Philip, always asking for sex even when I was tired or sick, as if that was the only thing keeping our marriage together. How could I love someone so much and yet feel so distant from him? The thought of leaving crossed my mind more times than I'd like to admit. But each time, something pulled me back. I really do love Philip, but I can't take this anymore. The buts in his character are too much for me to handle. The thought that constantly plagued my mind was, "Leave Philip, walk out, and call this marriage quits." Is this what you really want? Is divorce the solution? I often asked myself. These were the loudest, thought-based questions that plagued my mind every day. But deep down inside, I wanted solutions. I wanted Philip to change. I wanted to have my marriage restored. I wanted to be happy and in love every day with Philip, my husband. These desires seemed unattainable at that time. When all hopes were lost, when I finally was at the brink of leaving, there was a sudden, unexpected change and shift in Philip, and my marriage was saved. His change addressed and answered my questions and my needs as a wife and as a woman. My marriage was saved. My marriage was restored. This was how it all happened. This is my story. One night, being all alone in our bedroom, I stared blankly at the ceiling, unable to comprehend how my marriage had reached this point. Philip and I had once been so happy, or at least I thought we were. Lately, everything seemed to be falling apart. The man I once adored had become a source of constant frustration. His gentle nature that I had once admired was now overshadowed by his indecisiveness and lack of leadership. Where was the man who once swept me off my feet? Every day felt like a struggle. Philip could barely make a decision, leaving me to handle everything, from paying the bills to making crucial family choices. It wasn't that I didn't want to help. I just didn't want to be the only one carrying the weight of our lives. The kids were growing, and they needed their father, but he was lost in his own world, drowning in problems he didn't seem interested in solving. What hurt the most was his lack of emotional connection. I would come home exhausted from work, hoping for a hug, a smile, or just a simple "how are you?" Instead, I was met with silence, or worse, indifference. It felt like I was living with a stranger, someone who was there physically but had emotionally checked out long ago. Philip wasn't always like this. When we first got married, he was everything I had ever wanted in a husband. He was kind, attentive, and responsible. I could trust him to handle things without me having to worry. But as the years passed, it felt like he stopped caring about me, about the children, and even about himself. I couldn't understand what had changed. Was it me? Had I done something wrong? I tried to remember when things had started to unravel, but there was no clear answer. All I knew was that my expectations of marriage, of having a partner who was strong, decisive, and emotionally available were not being met, and it hurt more than I could put into words. There were times I would sit alone and cry, not knowing how to fix what was broken. I wanted to talk to Philip, but every time I tried, it felt like I was talking to a wall. His responses were short, dismissive even. He didn't seem to see the pain in my eyes or feel the distance growing between us. I needed him to step up, to be the man I married, but he wasn't there. Each day presented a new set of challenges, and I was left to face them alone. From managing the household finances to making decisions about the kids' education, everything fell on my shoulders. Philip, on the other hand, seemed more withdrawn. He had become content with doing the bare minimum, as if the weight of responsibility was too much for him to handle. It wasn't just the big things that bothered me, but the little things too. I had hoped for a man who would dress well, take pride in his appearance, and care for his family. Instead, Philip looked unkempt, as if he had given up on himself. It was embarrassing at times, especially when we were out in public. People noticed, and I couldn't help but feel ashamed. But what really broke me was his lack of attention to my emotional needs. I had always imagined marriage as a partnership where both husband and wife supported each other through thick and thin. Yet, when I needed him the most, Philip was nowhere to be found. I felt invisible, like my feelings didn't matter. The emotional neglect was suffocating, and I didn't know how much longer I could take it. One night, after a particularly hard day at work, I came home to find Philip sitting on the couch, watching TV as if nothing was wrong. The house was a mess, the kids were fighting, and I felt like I was on the verge of breaking down. "Can't you see I need help?" I snapped, the frustration spilling over. Philip barely looked up. "I'm tired, too," he muttered, as if that was supposed to make everything okay. That was the tipping point for me. I stormed upstairs, slammed the bedroom door shut, and collapsed on the bed, tears streaming down my face. How could he be so blind to what was happening around him? How could he not care? I spent hours that night lying awake, thinking about our marriage. The constant quarrels, the distance between us, the feeling of being unappreciated. It was all too much. For the first time, I seriously considered leaving. I couldn't continue like this, living in a marriage where I felt more alone than ever. But a small voice inside me whispered, "Don't give up just yet." As the days went on, the idea of leaving began to take root. It wasn't just about Philip's lack of responsibility or his emotional unavailability anymore. It was about my own happiness. Was I really willing to sacrifice the rest of my life for a marriage that seemed to be going nowhere? I loved Philip, but love alone wasn't enough to make up for the emptiness I felt. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I deserved better. I deserved a husband who cared about me, who would stand by my side and support me through life's challenges. Philip had become a shell of the man I married, and I didn't know if he would ever change. The constant comparisons to other men didn't help either. I would see how other husbands cared for their wives, how they took charge of their families, and I couldn't help but wonder why my life was so different. But leaving wasn't as easy as it seemed. We had built a life together, children, a home, memories. Walking away from all of that would be like tearing my heart in two. Yet the thought lingered in my mind, growing stronger with each passing day. Despite my doubts, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still hope for us. Deep down, I didn't want to give up on my marriage, even though every part of me screamed for escape. I decided to do the only thing I knew how to do in times of distress. I prayed. I had grown up in a Christian home, and prayer had always been a part of my life. But this time, it was different. I wasn't just praying out of habit, I was praying out of desperation. I asked God to intervene, to do something, anything, to save my marriage. "Lord, if there's a way to fix this, please show me," I whispered through my tears. "Help Philip see what he's doing to us." As the days turned into weeks, I continued to pray. I wasn't sure if anything would change, but I had to believe that God was listening. I wasn't ready to give up just yet. I needed to know that I had done everything I could before making a decision that could change our lives forever. Unbeknownst to me, Philip had also begun to reflect on our situation. The constant tension in the house, the lack of communication, and the emotional distance had not gone unnoticed by him. He knew that if something didn't change, he was going to lose everything: his wife, his children, and the life he had built. For the first time in months, Philip took a step back and really examined his life. He realized how much he had taken me for granted, how much he had neglected his role as a husband and father. It wasn't easy for him to admit, but he knew that he had failed in so many ways. The thought of losing me, the woman he still loved despite everything, shook him to his core. That night, Philip did something he hadn't done in a long time. He prayed. He asked God to help him, to show him how to be the husband and father his family needed. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was the first step toward change. In the days following his prayer, Philip began to make small changes. They weren't drastic, but they were noticeable. He started waking up earlier to spend time in prayer and reflection, asking God for guidance. He began reading books on marriage and self-improvement, seeking ways to become a better husband and father. At first, I didn't notice the changes. I was too caught up in my own pain to see what was happening. But slowly, I began to realize that Philip was different. He wasn't the same man who had ignored my needs and left me feeling invisible. He was trying, and that effort, no matter how small, meant the world to me. It wasn't just about the actions he was taking, it was about his attitude. He started listening more, paying attention to what I was saying, and responding with kindness instead of indifference. For the first time in a long while, I felt like Philip saw me again. He was present, and that was more than I could have asked for. Philip's transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was clear that his prayers were being answered. He began to lean on God more, seeking wisdom in every decision he made. It wasn't just about fixing the marriage, it was about becoming the man he knew he could be. The spiritual warfare prayers he prayed were powerful, drawn from his heart's deepest desires for change. He prayed for strength to overcome his weaknesses, for wisdom to lead his family, and for the grace to love me the way God intended. He prayed against the demons of complacency, selfishness, and laziness that had taken root in his life. As he prayed, something shifted inside him. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, a desire to be better not just for me, but for himself. He realized that if he wanted to save our marriage, it had to start with him. He had to be the one to change, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. It didn't take long for me to notice the changes in Philip. At first, I was skeptical, unsure if this was just a temporary phase or if he was truly committed to turning things around. But as the days went by, his actions spoke louder than any words he could have said. He started helping out more around the house, something I had been begging him to do for years. Whether it was cleaning up after the kids or cooking dinner, he took the initiative without me having to ask. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything to me. More importantly, Philip began to show more interest in my emotional well-being. He would ask how my day was, and for the first time in a long while, he genuinely listened to my response. He wasn't just going through the motions. He was present, engaged, and willing to make things right. As Philip continued to make changes, I found myself slowly letting go of the resentment I had been holding on to. It wasn't easy. Years of neglect had built walls around my heart that weren't going to come down overnight. But with each act of kindness, each moment of genuine care, those walls began to crack. I started to see Philip not as the man who had let me down, but as the man who was fighting to save our marriage. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and that effort made all the difference. It reminded me of the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago, the man who had promised to stand by my side no matter what. The love between us, which had once felt distant and cold, began to warm again. It wasn't an immediate flood of emotions, but a slow, steady rekindling of the fire that had once burned so brightly. One of the biggest challenges in our marriage had been intimacy, not just physical, but emotional. Philip had always struggled with expressing his emotions, and over time, that had created a barrier between us. I felt like I was constantly reaching out to him, only to be met with silence or indifference. But now, things were different. Philip was making an effort to connect with me on a deeper level. He started talking about his feelings, something he had rarely done in the past. He would share his fears, his hopes, and his struggles. And in doing so, he opened up a part of himself that I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't just about the physical aspect of our relationship, though that had improved as well. It was about feeling connected, like we were partners again, working together to build something stronger than before. One of the things I had always craved in our marriage was quality time. With the busyness of life, work, kids, and responsibilities, it often felt like Philip and I were living separate lives. We were roommates more than we were husband and wife. But as Philip continued to change, he made an effort to carve out time for us. Whether it was a simple walk in the park or a quiet evening at home, he prioritized spending time with me. It wasn't about doing anything grand or extravagant. It was about being together, reconnecting on a level we hadn't in years. Those moments, though small, made a world of difference. They reminded me that we were in this together, that we were still a team. And slowly but surely, the distance between us began to close. In the past, Philip rarely complimented me or acknowledged my efforts. It was something I had learned to live with, but it always stung. I wanted to feel appreciated, to know that my hard work didn't go unnoticed. But now, Philip made it a point to affirm me regularly. Whether it was a simple "thank you for all you do," or "you're an amazing mother," his words lifted me in ways I hadn't realized I needed. He wasn't just saying it for the sake of saying it. He meant it, and that made all the difference. His affirmations weren't just about me either. He began to affirm our marriage, speaking words of life and hope into a relationship that had once seemed on the brink of collapse. It was a reminder that our words have power, and Philip was using his to build us back up. Despite the progress Philip was making, the road to healing wasn't without its challenges. There were still moments of frustration, times when old habits threatened to creep back in. Change is never easy, and there were days when I wondered if we would ever fully recover from the damage that had been done. But every time we hit a rough patch, Philip didn't retreat like he used to. Instead, he faced the challenges head-on, determined to keep moving forward. He wasn't perfect, but he was committed, and that commitment was enough to keep us going. I, too, had to confront my own fears and doubts. It wasn't just about Philip changing. I had to change as well. I had to learn to trust again, to let go of the hurt and resentment that had built up over the years. It was a slow process, but with each step, I could feel our marriage growing stronger. Faith had always been a part of our lives, but in the midst of our marital struggles, it had taken a back seat. We were so consumed with the day-to-day challenges that we had neglected the spiritual foundation that had once held us together. But as Philip began to change, he also began to renew his relationship with God. He prayed more, seeking guidance not just for himself, but for our family. He turned to Scripture for wisdom, finding strength in verses like Proverbs 21:1, which reminded him that the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, as the rivers of water. He turneth it whithersoever he will. His renewed faith was contagious. It inspired me to reconnect with God as well, to seek his help in rebuilding our marriage. It wasn't about using faith as a crutch, but as a foundation, a reminder that we weren't in this alone, that God was with us every step of the way. Philip's transformation was slow but steady. He wasn't the man he had been when we first got married, but in many ways he was becoming someone better. He was more present, more engaged, and more willing to take responsibility for his role in our marriage. It wasn't just about the big gestures, though those were appreciated. It was about the little things. The way he would take my hand during a difficult conversation, the way he would listen without interrupting, the way he would make time for the kids even when he was tired. His transformation wasn't just about becoming a better husband. It was about becoming a better man. He was growing, not just for me, but for himself. And that growth was making all the difference in our marriage. Our prayer life had also become much stronger over the years. Prayer had always been a part of our lives, but now it was more important than ever. We prayed together, seeking God's guidance in our marriage and in our lives. Prayer wasn't just about asking for what we needed. It was about connecting with God and with each other. It was about inviting Him into our marriage and trusting that He would guide us through the challenges we faced. As we prayed together, we found that our connection grew stronger. We were no longer just relying on our own strength. We were relying on God's strength to carry us through. As Philip and I continued to rebuild our marriage, we both had to learn the importance of vulnerability. In the past, we had both been guilty of putting up walls, of hiding our true feelings out of fear of being hurt. But now we were learning to be more open with each other. We shared our fears, our insecurities, and our hopes for the future. It wasn't always easy. Being vulnerable requires a level of trust that we hadn't always had. But as we opened up to each other, we found that our connection grew deeper. Vulnerability wasn't about being weak. It was about being strong enough to let the other person see the real you. It was about trusting that they would love and accept you, flaws and all. And as we embraced that vulnerability, we found a new level of intimacy in our relationship. As Philip continued to change, I realized that there was one thing holding me back from fully embracing our new reality: forgiveness. I had been carrying around the weight of his past mistakes for so long that it had become a part of me. The hurt, the resentment, the anger. I didn't know how to let it go. But I knew that if our marriage was truly going to heal, I had to forgive him. It wasn't easy. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about choosing to let go of the pain, to release the person who hurt you so that you can move forward. I began to pray for the strength to forgive Philip, to release him from the mistakes he had made. And slowly, as I let go of the hurt, I found myself able to love him more freely. Forgiveness wasn't just a gift I was giving to Philip. It was a gift I was giving to myself. One of the biggest lessons we learned in our journey to healing was the importance of communication. In the past, we had both been guilty of shutting down, of avoiding difficult conversations or letting our frustrations fester until they exploded. But now we were learning to communicate in healthier ways. We talked openly about our feelings, our fears, and our hopes for the future. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of tension, but we were committed to keeping the lines of communication open. We learned that communication wasn't just about talking. It was about listening, really listening to what the other person was saying. It was about being vulnerable, about trusting each other with our innermost thoughts and feelings. And as we relearned how to communicate, we found that our connection grew stronger. As Philip and I continued to rebuild our marriage, we found ourselves rediscovering each other in new and exciting ways. It was almost like we were dating again, learning about each other's hopes, dreams, and fears. We had both changed over the years, but in many ways, those changes had made us stronger. Philip wasn't the same man I married, but that was okay. He was becoming someone better, someone more in tune with his own needs and the needs of our family. I too had changed. I had become more independent, more self-reliant, but I was learning to let go of some of that control and allow Philip to step up. It was a process of rediscovery, and in that process, we found new joy in each other's company. One of the most important lessons I learned during this time was the gift of patience. Healing takes time, and change doesn't happen overnight. There were moments when I wanted to see immediate results, when I wanted Philip to be the perfect husband right away. But I had to remind myself that growth is a process. Philip was trying, and that effort was worth more than any quick fix. I had to be patient with him, just as he had to be patient with me. We were both learning, both growing, and that required grace and understanding. Patience wasn't just about waiting for things to get better. It was about trusting that they would. It was about believing that the work we were putting into our marriage would pay off, even if we couldn't see the results right away. Philip had always been a man who struggled with taking responsibility for his actions, but now he was learning the importance of being accountable. He started meeting with a mentor from our church, someone who could guide him and hold him accountable for the changes he was trying to make. And this, in many ways, resulted in self-improvement. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about having someone to check in with, someone who could help him stay on track. Philip's journey of accountability and self-improvement wasn't just about becoming a better husband, it was about becoming a better man. He started reading books on personal development, attending workshops, and seeking out mentors who could guide him. It wasn't just about fixing the problems in our marriage. It was about addressing the underlying issues that had caused those problems in the first place. Philip realized that in order to be the husband and father he wanted to be, he had to work on himself first. His commitment to self-improvement was inspiring. It showed me that he wasn't just changing for me, he was changing for himself. And that made all the difference. Accountability and self-improvement wasn't just about Philip, though. I, too, had to learn to be accountable for my own actions. I had to take responsibility for the ways I had contributed to the breakdown of our marriage, and I had to be willing to work on myself as well. We had both been guilty of hurting each other, but neither of us had been willing to take responsibility for our actions. But as we worked on rebuilding our marriage, we both learned the importance of saying, "I'm sorry," where we are wrong, and taking responsibility for our actions. It wasn't just about the words. It was about acknowledging the hurt or error we had caused and committing to do better. Philip's apologies were heartfelt, and they helped to heal the wounds that had been festering for so long. I, too, learned to apologize for the ways I had hurt him. It wasn't about keeping score or placing blame. It was about taking responsibility for our actions and working together to move forward. It was a humbling experience, but it was also incredibly freeing. As Philip and I continued to rebuild our marriage, we both had to learn the importance of grace. We were both going to make mistakes along the way, and we had to be willing to extend grace to each other. In the past, we had both been guilty of digging our heels in, refusing to budge on certain issues. But now we were learning that compromise was essential to a healthy marriage. It wasn't about one person getting their way all the time. It was about finding a middle ground, a solution that worked for both of us. In our marriage, compromise wasn't always easy. It required us to put our egos aside and focus on what was best for our marriage. But as we learned to compromise, we found that we were both happier and more fulfilled. This was how we fully understood the importance of the gift of grace in a marriage. Grace wasn't about excusing bad behavior. It was about recognizing that we were both human, that we were both trying our best, and that sometimes we were going to fall short. It was about choosing to love each other in spite of our flaws, to offer forgiveness even when it was hard. Grace wasn't just a gift we gave each other. It was a gift we received from God. It was His grace that had brought us through the darkest times in our marriage, and it was His grace that continued to sustain us. Also, we both learned that grace without trust in a marriage would lead to disaster. Whenever there was conflict or misunderstanding, leading to hurtful feelings, lack of trust, that is, trust that the other loves you and means well, even though they messed up, makes healing from hurts very difficult. Trust had been one of the biggest casualties of our marital struggles. Over the years, Philip's lack of responsibility and emotional unavailability had eroded the trust I had in him. I didn't feel like I could rely on him, and that had created a barrier between us. But as Philip continued to change, I found myself slowly rebuilding that trust, and I was healing faster whenever we had painful episodes that took a toll on my emotions. I realized that healing isn't a linear process. There were times when Philip and I would take 2 steps forward only to take 1 step back. But through it all, we were committed to the journey. We both had wounds that needed to be healed. Wounds from our past, from the mistakes we had made, from the hurt we had caused each other. But as we worked through those wounds, by trusting the other still loves you and didn't mean to hurt you, we found that our marriage was becoming stronger. It wasn't easy. It took time and effort, but with each small step he took, I began to trust him more. Rebuilding trust wasn't just about Philip proving himself to me. It was about me letting go of the fear that had kept me from trusting him in the first place. Healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about building something new, something better. It was about choosing to believe in his transformation, to have faith that he was committed to being the husband and father we needed him to be. It was about learning from our mistakes and using them as stepping stones to create a marriage that was built on love, trust, and mutual respect. I also realized along the line that one of the things that had always been missing in our marriage was the feeling of being supported. I had always felt like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders, and Philip hadn't been there to help lighten the load. But now, Philip was stepping up in ways I had never imagined. He was more involved with the kids, more engaged in the household responsibilities, and more attentive to my emotional needs. He was becoming the partner I had always wanted, and it felt like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. His support wasn't just about doing things for me, it was about being there for me, emotionally and physically. It was about knowing that I wasn't in this alone, that we were a team, working together to build a life for our family. Supporting one another was a great treasure in our build-up to a better life as a family and as couples. It fostered setting healthy boundaries. As Philip and I continued to rebuild our marriage, we both realized the importance of setting healthy boundaries. In the past, we had both been guilty of letting work, stress, and other distractions get in the way of our relationship. But now, we were learning to prioritize each other and our family. We set boundaries around our time, making sure that we had regular date nights and quality family time. We set boundaries around our work, making sure that it didn't interfere with our time together. Boundaries weren't about shutting each other out. They were about creating space for us to grow closer. They were about protecting our marriage, making sure that we were both giving it the attention it needed to thrive. And this resulted in us developing the grace of being intentional towards one another in our relationship. That's why I believe that one of the things that made the biggest difference in our marriage was Philip's newfound sense of intention. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was intentional about everything he did. Whether it was spending time with the kids, helping out around the house, or making time for me, Philip was deliberate in his actions. He wasn't just doing things because he had to. He was doing them because he wanted to, because he knew they were important. His intention wasn't just about actions, it was about attitude. He was more present, more engaged, more focused on what really mattered. And that intention made all the difference in our marriage. The deepening of our intimacy also helped us a lot. Intimacy wasn't just about physical connection. It was about emotional, spiritual, and mental connection as well. Philip and I were learning to be more open and vulnerable with each other. We shared our deepest fears, hopes, and dreams. We prayed together, seeking God's guidance in our marriage, and we made time for physical intimacy, recognizing that it was an important part of our connection. Intimacy wasn't just about being close physically, it was about being close in every aspect of our lives. And as we deepened our intimacy, we found that our love for each other grew stronger every day. The journey to rebuilding and fully restoring our marriage continues, but Philip and I realized that our love had been restored in ways we never could have imagined. Our marriage had been tested, but it had come out stronger, deeper, and more connected than ever. Love wasn't just about the big moments, it was about the small, everyday acts of kindness, care, and commitment. It was about showing up for each other, being there in the good times and the bad. One evening, after a particularly wonderful day, I found myself in tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. I looked at Philip and I saw the man I had prayed for. He had transformed, not into someone else, but into the man he was always meant to be. His change has also changed me as well. His actions softened my heart, and I found myself falling in love with him all over again. The constant quarrels became fewer, the comparisons ceased, and instead of looking outside, I began to appreciate the man inside my home. The love and romance that had once felt like a distant memory blossomed again, filling our home with laughter, joy, and peace. Our marriage was saved not because of grand gestures, but because Philip made the choice to change. He prayed, worked on himself, and fought for our love. And as he changed, so did I. Our story isn't perfect, but it's ours. And now, more than ever, I am reminded that love isn't about finding the perfect person, but loving someone through their imperfections. We found our way back to each other, and this time we were stronger, more connected, and deeply in love. As we embraced the blessing of love restored, we found that our marriage was flourishing. We were no longer just surviving, we were thriving, building a life that was full of joy, passion, and mutual respect. And as we looked toward the future, we knew that our love would continue to grow stronger every day. This is our story, the story of Philip and I, and it explains what every wife wants and needs in a marriage to make it work. It also explains what every husband should do or attend to make his marriage work. For too long, men and how to keep your man has been the focus in every discussion about marriage or relationship. But what about how to keep your wife, or how to make your wife happy? What about what a wife or woman desires in her husband? What about the needs of women, what they want to see in their husband, or what they expect from them? Hardly do people talk about these things. Hardly do people address these issues. Women, wives also have needs. Their feelings and needs also matters in a relationship. So I recommend that all men, husbands, and partners should watch this video. Couples should also watch this video together. I believe there are principles here that will immensely help in restoring and rejuvenating your marriage. Philip and I are still working together on our relationship. Issues still come up. Challenges do arise from time to time, but we have grown and are better equipped to deal with them, without them posing a threat to our union together. To you watching this video, and to you listening to our story, I pray God keeps and bless you. I really wish you the best in your marriage. I pray God intervenes in every situation that is a threat to your marriage. May restoration be your portion. May you find and experience abundant peace, rest, joy, and love in your marriage. I love you. God loves you more.
Follow this page or subscribe to this channel for more stories. Follow this page or subscribe to this channel for more stories.